Good afternoon and welcome. I'm David Klaus, the Consulting Director of the Wilson Center on the Hill program. And as we get started, please feel free to get your lunch and sit down. But I'll do the niceties while everyone gets settled, and then we'll be started. Welcome to this program, jointly sponsored by Wilson Center on the Hill and by the Canada Institute. Wilson Center for those of you who don't know, Wilson Center on the Hill was established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Wilson, the only president to have a PhD and serve as President of the United States, and having served as President of Princeton University earlier in his career before Governor of New Jersey, etc. So the Wilson Center combines his interest in academic issues with public policy, and that's what the Wilson Center tries to do. Wilson Center on the Hill was established 2 years ago. We do about 20 of these programs a year, and we do take members of Congress and congressional staff on congressional trips periodically to help them see firsthand what goes on around the world on issues such as this. And we do that with the support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which provides a grant for this program and others. And so I extend my thanks to the Hewlett Foundation for that. Our partner on this program is the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center. David Biette back there is the director. And on behalf of I would also like to thank, on behalf of our partner for today's program, the Canada Institute, I'd like to recognize Brian Siegel, the president and CEO of Rogers Publishing, and Ken White, the vice president of Rogers Consumer Publishing, and publisher of Maclean's, see if I can get this right, Chantelane, Canadian Business Profit and Money Sense magazines, and for their support for this issue of One Issue, Two Voices, and for their support for this program, which actually this is the first of two. The second portion of this program will take place in Canada next week. So we want to thank them very much for their support for this program. Let me share with you the next program for Wilson Center on the Hill happens on May 21st in actually this room. Very interesting program. We will bring up a group of Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellows. They are people who actually spend most of their lives teaching in high schools and elementary schools across the United States, and they are selected as, there's a group that are selected as the finest teachers in America, and they come to Washington, spend a year working in public policy, and we're going to bring them up here and have them share with you sort of how the world of policy intersects with actual day-to-day life in the classroom. And we've done this once before. It's absolutely fascinating. We hope that you will join us for that program on May 21st. If you don't have an invitation to that program, please leave us a card, and we will put you on the list for this and all future programs. One other thing you have on your tables, two things. You have a copy of the paper for this. You also have a copy of a little card for the Wilson Center, and on the back of that, if you would like to receive publications or information about different programs for the Wilson Center, please fill that card out, leave it on the table. We'll add you to our mailing list, and we promise not to sell or distribute it in any way, shape, or form. One final thought about today's program. It kind of reminded me when I think about globalization and the challenges of globalization. It reminded me of a comment I had once with a friend who was off to join one of the big New York law firms, and he had asked one of the other people in the law firm, says, how is life here? And the guy said, life's not so bad in the Shark Tank until you start removing some of the water. And I think that's a little bit of what goes on in the global economy as you face economic crises and challenges. You get the challenges really become much more interesting, and you come up with issues such as the one that we have today. With that, let me introduce our moderator for the program today, Bill Christ, who is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center, and he will steer you through today's events. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our program today. I think it's going to be a very interesting program. We have two very good speakers with two very different perceptions, both on the immediate issue of government procurement and then much more broadly on the philosophical issue of how the U.S. and Canada and others should approach trade policy. So I'm expecting a really good debate between our two speakers. I think the topic today is very timely. First off, The issue of government procurement preferences is probably going to come up again in other legislation like climate change and things like that. So what lessons we learned from this experience maybe will be helpful to you all here on the Hill and as you deal with those issues. Secondly, in the World Bank Global Trade Alert, they list some 44 different actions that countries have taken in restricting barriers on government procurement. I'm sorry, not necessarily taken. A lot of those measures actually haven't been implemented, but a lot of them have, and some of them are fairly significant. So I think our experience can help shape how people look at country actions on this in general. Real quick, before I introduce our two speakers, let me just take 2 minutes and set out the context of the government procurement issue. Historically, government procurement has been a major tool that countries have used for industrial policy or for other policy objectives like promoting minority business or small business or regional development or what have you. A major change came in the Tokyo round in 1979 with the Government Procurement Code, which was signed on to by some countries, and then it was expanded in the Uruguay round and made part of the WTO. It's one of only 2 plurilateral agreements, which means that if a country hasn't signed onto the code, they don't get any of the benefits of the code necessarily. It's a major change in the Tokyo round from what had existed up to that point because the GATT had only applied to basically to measures at the border, whereas government procurement is a policy that's taken inside the borders. Right now, there's 41 countries that have signed on to the Procurement Code out of the 153 WTO members. It's not a most favored nation agreement, unlike almost all the other agreements under the WTO. When the code went into effect, the Canadian provinces had not signed on to it. 37 U.S. states did sign on to it. And the code was extended in some of the U.S. free trade agreement negotiations that took place over the last 10 years. Well, then comes the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and its provision that basically said that funds used for construction of public buildings and public works could only be used if they included iron, steel, and manufactured products of U.S. origin. And otherwise, they could not be. And then it added an exemption that this would have to take place consistent with U.S. International obligations, which basically meant the World Trade Organization and America's free trade agreements like NAFTA. This, of course, created a big uproar. A lot of people in the U.S. yelled this was protectionist and a violation of the pledges made by heads of state not to increase trade barriers. The Canadians were particularly upset by it, partly because of the context of the NAFTA agreement, and also because the U.S. and the Canadian economies are so tightly intertwined. So as a result of that, U.S. and Canadian negotiators sat down and worked out a bilateral agreement, which I think you'll hear a lot about here this afternoon, that went into effect on February 16th, 2010. And that agreement has both temporary measures and it has permanent measures to it. On the temporary measure side, the U.S. agreed to allow Canadian firms to have access under 7 projects under the Recovery and Reconstruction Act, and the Canadians agreed to give U.S. access in construction services. And then for permanent changes, the Canadians opened up their provincial procurement to U.S. suppliers, and the U.S. opened up procurement to our 37 states. So that's basically a quick context of it, and I'd like now to introduce our two speakers who I think will have very interesting comments to make on this whole issue. Our first speaker is going to be Robert Baugh, Executive Director of Afl-Cio Industrial Union Council, which is the coordinating body for the Federation's manufacturing policy and legislative initiatives. He served as the leader of U.S. labor delegations to a number of United Nations Climate Change Conference negotiations and regularly testifies before Congress. Our second speaker is William Robson, as President and CEO of C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, which is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that aims to improve Canadian standard of living by fostering sound economic and social policy. His works on demographic change and healthcare financing and on monetary policy have won a number of awards, and he's a regular columnist for the Globe and Mail. So with that, we'll go ahead and get underway, and we'll start with you, Bob.
Thank you, Bill, and I would like to thank the Canada Institute and the Wilson Center for having us here today, for having this timely discussion. You will find that Bill and I have taken very different approaches to the questions that were raised today. And I think the title of the first article that I wrote for this, The Economic Reality and Alarmist Rhetoric, Getting Real About Buy America, really sums up where I'm coming from on this subject. The other Bill Chris, was absolutely right when he said that we passed a bill in the midst of the greatest economic crisis this nation or the world has seen since the Great Depression to accomplish a couple of important objectives. One, it was to answer the call to respond to the economic crisis with a stimulus package designed to create jobs and move money through this economy to get it back on its feet. We also made a down payment on a new energy policy for the nation with the same thought in mind. How do you do this to create good green jobs in the American economy when you make this investment both in our economy and the environment? We were hit with the howls and screams of nations that you're protectionist, you're mercantilist, there's going to be reciprocal actions, my God, there's going to be trade wars. Nonsense, overblown rhetoric. I think we just lost our sound. A lot of overblown rhetoric in this subject designed to scare people about what had really happened. And in fact, we found not only nations responding that way, we found parts of the economic community and the political community in this country responding the same way. Now, from the perspective of a taxpayer, to try and tell the American public you're not going to take money to stimulate your economy and try to make sure you actually move it through your economy by spending it here is just plain common sense. But for the free trade fundamentalists and the free market fundamentalists out there, by God, you can't do that. There should be no rules, regulations, or inhibitions in any of that process. Well, I'm here to tell you we completely disagree, and so did Congress. That's the reason they put language in this legislation. Moreover, I think we need to step back and use this as a dead serious learning moment, because this debate here today is not just about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It really is about the American economy and the direction we're going to take in the 21st century as we address a series of major questions which I'll raise as we go along. The purpose, as I said, of the Recovery Act was simply to stimulate the U.S. economy and at the same time took some action on generating new jobs through a new energy investment in the nation. The Buy American laws we invoked, in fact, have been on the books since 1933 and are recognized, just as all kinds of other actions in other countries are recognized under the agreements on procurement and government procurement. We did it, and we said we would be consistent, as Bill pointed out, with our international trade agreements. And for all of you in this room, we're the ones who suggested that language, the labor movement. It might surprise everybody. We did. We actually believe in trade, and we believe in trade agreements that are real and work. Now, do we have those? I think I would beg to differ about some of the things we've said and done around these things. One of the things that was strange about this is that the countries raising these charges loudest and hardest, and the EU ambassador ran across the United States, debated Rich Trumka on public TV around these things, the president of the Afl-Cio today. is our charge is that we were doing these terrible things, invoking these rules. Well, the funny part is Canada has rules on procurement that are stronger and more pervasive than ours. The EU has rules on this that are stronger and more pervasive than ours. And ironically, China was standing there doing the same kind of yelling about what we had done. Now, this is a country that has an 80% domestic content rule on its $586 billion stimulus package and has now passed rules around indigenous innovation that our business community is deeply concerned about in terms of rating their intellectual property and the future of those industries. So I think there's an issue here that this became a use of protectionism, which is raised over and over again as a pejorative, to stop debate, to stop discussion, to brand the people who say anything that have concerns about how we practice trade policy as bad people or wrong people. And so I'm kind of used to it. I'm a trade unionist, and I have friends who are in the economics community and others who have questions about our trade policy or how we practice it. We believe in smart trade. We believe in fair trade. We believe in balanced trade. We don't believe in some of the trade we've been doing. Yet initially you're always called protectionist, and it reaches levels of absurdity. I was at an international meeting in February of diplomats that I was invited to at the Carnegie Institute, and there we had a Chinese diplomat get up and say the U.S. is protectionist because we had won a tire case against China for their practices. And they said, by us going to the ITC using an adjudication process recognized under the law and winning the case, and all the diplomats in the room said, oh, yeah, you guys are all protectionists, you did this. And I said, do you understand what the Chinese did, that they had a law in place that, in fact, the company that opened up to do business there had to export all their goods out? It wasn't for the domestic market, and, in fact, we were the targeted country for those products that were putting workers in the United States out of business, out of jobs. And everybody said, well, we didn't know that. The Chinese admitted to it. That's how they lost the case. They said, well, that's illegal under WTO. And I said, that's right. And they said, but the U.S. is still protectionist for pursuing this. I mean, you can't win for losing in a case like this. You use an adjudication process that's legal and recognized, and you're still called a protectionist. So I get real tired of the charges of protectionism. I don't know whether I hate it or we should just embrace it and say it's all BS, it doesn't mean anything, and it's avoiding the larger discussion at hand. And that's what we're concerned about, is this larger discussion. We have a cross-crisis border here. The integration of the Canadian-American economy is apparent. I grew up in Detroit, in Michigan. It's no more apparent there than anywhere else in the country in relation to the production of autos in the North American economy. We are integrated. You're talking about $600 billion of two-way trade between Canada and the United States. This ARRA, the Recovery Act, has only a little sliver piece of what that may even be about. We find the charges of being protectionist absolutely Orwellian. Think about this. This is a country that 2 years ago ran an $840 billion trade deficit. How in God's, if we're being protectionist, we're not doing very good at it with that kind of a deficit. We ran an $144 billion trade deficit in that same period with Canada and Mexico, our NAFTA trading partners. I mean, so, and with China calling us protectionist when they have indigenous innovation and have 80% domestic content rules is ridiculous. It's Orwellian. And that's why this stuff doesn't make sense, and it's name-calling that takes us away from the real crisis we have at hand with the integrated economies. In this country, in the last decade, we had 57,000 manufacturing facilities close. We lost 6 million jobs in manufacturing. And yes, you look at me and say, oh, he's a trade unionist. He's talking about those people who do the work on the front lines. Of course I am. 2 million of those jobs, a majority of them, of the 6 million, were actually engineers, of that other third that was left from the frontline jobs. They're scientists, they're engineers, they're designers, they're developers. They're the people that are critical to the innovation and capacity, our intellectual capacity to make things in the United States. That's who lost those jobs. We have destroyed the base of our competencies and our capacities for the future in part of the process, and it is directly related to these trade issues overall and the direction we're heading. That's the crisis we are in manufacturing in the United States. That's the crisis we face in a North American economy. And I say Canada and the United States together in this. We are both advanced industrial nations that have been hammered this way. But you know what? Other high-wage, high-performance, advanced industrial nations haven't gone through some of this. Japan hasn't. Germany hasn't. Finland hasn't. They retain their industrial base. They have good jobs. They've faced these crises and done it very, very differently than us. It means there's something really amiss here in all of this. Part of this crisis is the loss of the production, as I said, the R&D. It means where are these next investments going to be made in the economies of the world? They're not going to be here if we move our production and lose that, and lose the R&D competencies that go with that for the development of the new opportunities. We've been trading away jobs. I've mentioned the staggering deficits. I don't need to say that again. I do need to make the point, though, that in 2008, of that deficit, of the manufacturing portion of our trade deficit, which is the largest piece of that $800+ billion deficit, manufacturing is over $500 billion of that. China was 68% of it. 68% of the manufactured goods. Right now, they're 80% of the trade deficits we're running. We need to pay attention here. Now, I do not fault China for having a strategy. You know, Germany has a strategy, Japan has a strategy, China has a strategy. I will go after them for everything they do illegal in support of that. Currency manipulation in China, lack of worker rights, other forms of illegal subsidies. We need to enforce our trade laws and enforce it internationally. But they have a strategy. I'll never fault them for that. We don't. Shame on us. Shame on Canada. They're pretty close to us in this. But the rest of the world, these other countries, the advanced industrial nations, actually have strategies around their manufacturing base and pursue them around their industries and around technologies. And it makes a difference in the jobs they generate, the jobs they keep, the jobs they create, and where they are going in their future. That's what this is all about in this Buy American discussion. Buy America is tactical. It's not strategic. It says we should do what? Well, if we're going to spend money, we should try to buy American. Now, if you can't find it here, and if you can't find it even under our international trade agreements, you can get waivers. And the government does grant those. But the idea is, look in your backyard first. So it's tactical to encourage investment in the American economy, to encourage manufacturers to produce goods for that economy. It is not strategic because it doesn't develop the industries and target the technologies and these things that we need to do for the future if we're going to invest in high-speed rail systems or the modernization of the grid or renewable energy technologies that we used to lead the world in with our government investments. We no longer do because we took a walk from this stuff. But this is the conversation that it is now time to have. We have a $4 trillion question in front of us. We have a $2.2 trillion deficit in infrastructure, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. That's a deficit. The stuff we built 30, 40 years ago is old. We need to replace it. We need to fix it. We need high-speed rail. We need to make these changes. We also have the issue of climate, and how do you address that? Again, trillions of dollars of investments that will be made to lower carbon emissions, to become more energy efficient, to produce clean energy, and everything from carbon capture and sequestration to advanced automotive technology. The question is, will we make it here? And that's the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves about how will we make it here, because this generates good employment for the working middle class of this nation. And that is what has been so devastated across the last decade and has led to the situation we are in, with wage stagnation, massive job losses in the manufacturing sector, and the institutional and industrial capacity that I talked about. It even spills over into what has been our health care crisis. Who do you think the last 5 million people who lost health coverage were? They were the people who used to work in manufacturing where they had it. I mean, these things are connected. They play off each other. It's about the prosperity of the American economy. You cannot have a prosperous economy that is completely driven, its economic policy is completely driven by a consumer mentality. And this is where Bill and I vehemently disagree. That you can't have consumerism dictating the concepts by which our economy operates and functions. Because if you lose the people who earn good incomes, they can't consume. They take away from our ability and capacity to produce goods for the future. If you're not producing those goods for the future, you have nothing to trade. If you have nothing to trade, you're never going to solve your trade deficit. I mean, these things are circular and they connect to one another. And that's why we have to pay attention as a country about how we address these issues and how we move forward in the future. We have common problems, and we got to have some common sense around this. As I said, ARIA, the Recovery Act, was an attempt to do so, to look at these issues in a combined fashion. Here's my 2-minute warning. In a combined fashion that connects the dots between them. That's how we're looking at this. And that's why I say Buy American is one piece of an issue that is a really larger question for the American economy about how we move together in the future to create good jobs. Climate change and this issue of our economic recovery are related directly. And here's why. If you ever read the Stern report from the Stern Commission in the United Kingdom about climate change, it recognized that climate disaster we're facing is the greatest market failure in the history of the world. We coupled that up with the greatest economic consequence or failure since the Great Depression. Also, unregulated, unrestricted markets not functioning in the interest of countries or the rest of the world, operating outside the boundaries of rules. That's a problem. It means we need government engagement to figure out how to move forward together and let the markets work with us and for us, as opposed to operating and thinking there'll never be a consequence, because we are paying those consequences both in the climate and the economic disaster that we're trying to recover from currently. We have pushed this measure around a just transition in climate internationally with the trade union movement. It simply says you should go out there to address climate with the goal of creating good jobs as you do it, increasing per capita income. You do it by modernizing your industries, developing and deploying new technology, training and skilling your workers to address those changes, and taking care of the people who are adversely affected by either climate legislation or climate change itself. That's something we agree upon across the world with our unions. And so we find our unions and our countries, each of us in everyone we're working with, my brothers and sisters in the Canadian Labour Congress, we want to find a way to take our energy and environment investments to create good jobs in our economy. And this is what scares me. The hullabaloo over us being protectionist around Buy American measures is frankly what every country in the world is thinking about doing, about how do we make these investments to create good jobs in our economy. And I think our trade laws, our trade practices, the WTO is completely out of step with what countries need to do and how we need to take action to address these issues. I think there's a simple message in all this. There really is a better way than we have chosen to do following the rules of free market fundamentalism and free trade fundamentalism. We cannot base our 21st century economies on some outdated 19th century economic theories that have flaws in them, that didn't recognize the fundamental economic changes because it's 2 centuries later. That's part of the problem in this free trade debate. We need to take steps in a new direction around domestic investment policies, our trade policies, our idea that we want a vibrant economy in our country for manufacturing, in Canada for manufacturing, that creates good jobs and a future for the people who live and work in both our countries. I think Buy American and Buy Canadian is an opportunity to open the door to this much-needed discussion about countries that need a strategy for their manufacturing base, our environment, and our future. Thank you.
Well, let me also begin by thanking the Wilson Center and the Canada Institute for the invitation to be here today. And I do want to emphasize that Dave Biet and Stephanie McLuhan really leaned on me hard because I did hesitate at the beginning. I am not a trade lawyer. I have not worked in government procurement. And when I mentioned this project to a good friend who is a trade lawyer who has worked in government procurement, he said, "Oh, good for you getting into that quagmire." I thought, well, that's ambiguous encouragement. And hearing Bob, reading Bob's essay and hearing him just now, about how Buy American could fit into a much larger project of interventions to reshape the U.S. or even the world economy makes it clear that if you buy the quagmire analogy, this swamp sort of stretches across the horizon and is very, very deep in places. Now, I know some people were skimming the publication on the way in, but since I'm sure most of you haven't yet read every footnote in this issue of One Issue, Two Voices, I'll start by highlighting the key fault lines between Bob and myself, and then venture a little bit into the bog and how the February agreement between the United States and Canada could help us through it. But my main point is that the natural negotiating focus, which is all tit for tat, my concession for your concession, or even why the U.S. and Canada ought to make a special deal between the two of them that shuts other countries out, that if that's the approach, we're going to stay mired in the muck. We have to talk to each other, clearly, but we have to do much more than that. Supporters of open borders have to relentlessly make the case in both countries that discriminatory procurement, it's just like trade tariffs and quotas. The most harm that is done when you raise these things is done not to the people whose exports are shut out of your market, but to you yourself, to your citizens, and in the case of government procurement, to the taxpayers and the users of the public services. Now, I think most of us are sort of free traders at one level, in principle, or up to a point, because we know that we do better if we exchange with each other than if every one of us tried to grow our own food and make our own clothing and build our own houses and do our own surgery and so on. And the case for free trade among states and provinces and between countries is just extending that same logic across national borders. Not everybody finds that intuition compelling, and not everybody has studied comparative advantage in economic classrooms. But the evidence is very stark. There was a reference already to the 1930s. If the original Buy American Act was sort of a mud patch in this swamp, then the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was the killer quicksand. That was an economic and ultimately a global political disaster as well. And after the war, that lesson learned, the U.S. and Canada were leaders in the move to liberalize trade. That was a big success. We had unprecedented growth of incomes and jobs and output. Special deals such as the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, also very helpful. And when you look around the modern world, there's this powerful correlation between openness and prosperity. And the growing integration across borders has been a product of this success, but it also has fostered it because it makes it clearer to many producers who need inputs from abroad that just as is the situation with consumers, if you erect a barrier at the border, it's the economic equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot. Or to stay with the swampy analogy, maybe putting a hole in your own boat. So that's the overview of the fault line. Now, before venturing closer to the swamp, let me just emphasize, since Bob and I live on opposite sides of the Canada-U.S. border, what Bob said already, that this is a fault line that doesn't run across the border. It runs through both our countries. And having argued against Canadian economic nationalists at the time of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA, I know their fears and suspicions well. Happily, free trade with the United States did not bear those fears and suspicions out. There are some attempts to revive them as Canada is looking at free trade talks with the European Union. So far, I don't see much traction. And what I'm particularly pleased about is that one of the Canadian government's first moves in response to this crisis was unilaterally cutting tariffs on a lot of intermediate and capital goods as a way of relieving cost pressures on businesses. So that's good, but if Bob and I agree on anything, it's certainly that Canada's hands in this area are not clean, and my message, and we'll see how this goes over in Ottawa next week, but my message is that Canada's hands should be a lot cleaner. So why the quagmire? Why is government procurement such a swamp? Traditional protection is about governments getting in between a buyer and a seller, a willing buyer and seller, and putting a tariff or a quota in the way. And the buyer, who is spending his or her own money and wants the product for its own sake, they're directly affected. They know who to press for relief. So that's one of the major reasons why international agreements have had such success bringing that type of barrier down. But when a government official buys something, it's different. Typically, she or he is not using her or his own money, probably not going to be a direct user of the services that the purchase is going to provide, so that creates an agency problem. And taxpayer and consumer interests are diluted, and mixed mandates, maybe favoring certain industries or favoring certain regions, those things can seem quite normal, and Bob has made this point. And that's why international agreements have had a harder time limiting discriminatory procurement, especially by subnational governments, and in Canada and the United States they are very major buyers. So in the written essay, I go through all the mud and the bulrushes and the alligators of the procurement codes of the Tokyo round and the Canada-U.S. agreement and the NAFTA. And as Bill Christ was just taking us through, the government procurement agreement at the World Trade Organization, which for the first time puts some multilateral discipline on subnational purchases. But as some in the room will know very well, Canada didn't even want to get its feet wet there, just left all of the subnational stuff out. So again, I'll just emphasize this isn't a north-south divide. Bob has legitimately said that there are some pots calling kettles black in this area, and I just want to establish that I am not a pot or a kettle. This really won't go over well. There's a representative of the government of Quebec, I think, in the room somewhere, so this won't go over well there either. But just for bona fides, this is a paper from last month I co-wrote that attacks Canada's cartels in dairy and poultry and eggs, urges winding them down by selling new production quotas, which the farmers really won't like. These schemes are ludicrously protectionist. They're so retrograde. They raise the price of basic groceries, which hurts low-income people the most. Has the family farm survived? No, the family farm is declining. Employment is declining. Output is declining in the industry. The number of farms new entrants can't afford to get in hasn't helped the Canadian trade balance one iota. So it's a spectacular example of a failure of protectionism. I agree with Bob. Canadian governments have a lot of work to do, and in the government procurement area, they have a lot of work to do as well. They should have done it years ago, including more of the provincial procurement in the agreement. And as Bob notes in his essay, quite rightly, the threat to Canadian exports from the Buy American provisions in the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act prodded Canada into action, and that's one of the reasons why we have the February agreement. So as many of you will know who follow this, it gives Canadian suppliers access to procurement covered by the current U.S. appendix to the GPA. Similarly, U.S. suppliers gain access to provincial procurement as set out in a new Canadian appendix, and it expands access on both sides of the border for Canadian suppliers to a range of state and local public works that are funded by the ARRA, and for U.S. suppliers in somewhat reciprocal fashion across a range of construction contracts in Canada. This is temporary, running out in September of 2011. But there's a commitment for both countries to further discussions to liberalize further or perhaps cement these gains. Now, in reading the commentary on this, I was sad but not surprised to see that there was a lot of the sort of mercantilist adversarial language. So it's all couched in terms of the new export opportunities and the victories on the side that gained the market access and the concessions that were made by the side that gave it up. And for a free trader, this is all backwards. I mean, the real significance is the gains to the taxpayers and the consumers of public services in both countries. Because if this agreement has material effect, they're going to get a better balance of quality and price than they could have before. And if we can succeed in extending the temporary provisions after 2011 or delivering on the promise of further negotiations, that would deliver larger and more lasting benefits to the taxpayers and the consumers of public services in both countries. Now, when I read Bob's contribution to this exchange, I was sad but not really surprised not to see much emphasis on the taxpayer and consumer interests, and Bob's been very strong on this point. I mean, I'll just, on the China story, mention that for a free trader, the most salient point there is that the U.S. government forced U.S. consumers to pay more for tires. That's the key story. That's the headline. But what was disappointing to me was that with the Canada-U.S. deal, I guess it was concluded as we were preparing these essays, I was looking for some practical advice on that front, and I didn't see it. So a few thoughts from me in closing on what to do there, what the people in the hip waders need to do next. On the swampy front, we clearly need to engage at the negotiating table, cement the gains that have been made to date, ensure that the elements of the GPA that govern the bilateral relations are the most liberal available. Both federal governments can clean up their games. There's a long list there. You just look at surface transportation, for example. Then there's the issue of getting the subnational governments to the table. Now, I mean no disrespect to the negotiators of this thing, but if you look at the appendix in Canada of what's covered and what isn't covered, it looks, and there are trade lawyers in the room, so correct me if I get this wrong, but it looks like it was done in a bit of a hurry. It could stand a lot of cleaning up. There's some reconciling of what looked to me like contradictions to be done. And certainly Canada has to get its act together in this area in a big way. Agriculture is only tangentially covered by this. But since I mentioned agriculture already, Canada may have cut itself out of the Pacific trade talks thanks to our protectionism there. We're talking to the EU. We have just got to deal with it. Second point, complementary, is the reaching out to the consumers and the users of the intermediate goods those interests on the other side of the border. I'm not sure if it was in this room, but I know there was a video recently of the Canadian-made pipes being dug back up out of the ground in California. A huge waste of the U.S. taxpayers' money, disruption to the people who were planning to get the service provided by those pipes. On the Canadian side of the border, there are a lot of Canadians who are getting tax weary. They're getting more sensitized to the problems created by discriminatory procurement. The electricity sector is an example. I won't go into it unless someone's interested, but the cost of electricity are skyrocketing in Canada very much as a result of this type of policy. So there's a constituency in both countries that's impatient with the quagmire and just wants things to work. Third point, I hark back to that wise old saying that when you're up to your proverbials and alligators, it can be hard to recall your original goal was to drain the swamp. If you're a free trader, you can't get mired down in the mercantilism arguing the other guy should drop his barriers, but you're going to keep yours, or maybe just trade them off grudgingly. Liberalization benefits the liberalizer. It doesn't matter whether you're a state, a province, or a country, and it's the taxpayers and the consumers of public services in both countries who will benefit if our governments buy as readily across the other side of the border as they do at home. And the stakes here are very high. Non-wage spending by our governments is about 1/8 of gross domestic product in both countries. So in Canada, it's about as big as the average value of exports and imports. In the United States, it's about half that size. But it's a very large sector of the economy. So any additional bang for the buck in this area leaves us way ahead. In Canada, it's the provinces that are the most important target for the argument, and our federal government can be more aggressive in getting them not to discriminate against suppliers that are based in the United States or in each other, for that matter. On the U.S. side, Americans will be the best judges of where and how to make the case to their compatriots, but I certainly hope that they will make it. One of the bleakest stories in economic policy making was the effort by more than 1,000 economists. They disagreed on many topics, but they agreed on free trade in 1930 to get President Hoover to veto the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. They said it would hurt consumers. They said it would not improve the U.S. trade balance or create employment. They said that it threatened international economic cooperation and world peace, and they failed in their effort. And what happened next, to my mind, proves that they were right. So far, we've avoided the 1930s scale economic disaster that 18 months ago we were fearing, but people certainly are hurting. Governments are frighteningly overextended, and we have just recently been reminded again of the security risks that tempt us all to turn inward. Canada and the United States should work together, including in the bilateral negotiations, to build on the February deal to keep the borders open. And we mustn't get bogged down in the quagmire. We have to go there, but we can't stay there. We have to say loudly and without embarrassment that the interests of our citizens as taxpayers and consumers of public services are front and center. And every concession by a state, a province, or a national government is a win for them. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Bill. Well, thank you both. I think you did a really great job of laying out the issues and the debate, and I think probably a lot of you have a lot of questions and things that you want to raise. So let's get into that. Let me ask you, when you raise a question, if you could give your name and what office you're from. And we would like to start by having congressional staffers or members ask questions first, and when they're done, we'll open it up to everybody. So, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I just want to remind you.
Oh, yes. When you ask your question, we have a portable mic. Please be sure to speak into the microphone as we go. Okay, well, let's open it up. Who would like to go first? Yes.
John Vasey with Congressman Lipinski. I have a question for Mr. Robson. The only reason we saw, in my opinion, these changes and these improvements in the negotiations between the U.S. and Canada is because of the provisions in ERA. If one side gives up everything in a negotiation, they tend to not get very much in return. How would you respond to that? This is an ongoing process rather than one person leaping fully into the pool and expecting somebody else to follow after. So in that sense, don't we need some back and forth here and an ongoing engagement of lawmakers and others?
I don't deny that that was a strong spirit of Canadian action. The argument that you got to keep your negotiating chips is a very familiar one. The point that I'd make in return is, first of all, you treat these things as an asset, but actually if you buy my argument, and I know many people don't, but if you buy my argument, they're a liability. They're very costly. In Canada, the argument, for example, in agriculture has long been that if we simply do something unilaterally on this front, what do we get in return? Well, the answer is people can afford more food. It's that simple and that straightforward. If they are a negotiating chip and you like to have them there for that reason, I guess the only other thing that I would say is you have to be prepared to use them. And again, I'm more familiar with the Canadian side, so I won't presume to offer advice on the U.S. side. But a negotiating chip that you're going to put on the table and get something in return, okay, that might have value as an asset, but you have to be prepared at some point to put it on the table and see it go. And in many cases, when I look at some of the biggest protectionist barriers that exist in my country, what we're hearing is the justification that it's a negotiating chip, but it's not one they're actually planning to put on the table. So it's a liability that you never convert into currency.
Okay. Who's next?
I just want to make an additional comment because Bill's raised it a couple of times, the issue of taxpayers and consumers. And I think it deserves some of a response. I think that it's problematical to say that your entire economy is going to be dictated by the needs of the consumers. When you start talking about putting consumption over production in every instance, that leads to a set of other problems. In the United States, that's exactly what's been going on here. Unmitigated debt that comes from our bankers, financial community, from foreign sources, China and others, to put the foundation below American consumption. At the same time, we're eliminating our capacity to produce, reducing and losing jobs that are good middle-income jobs. I mean, you have to understand, the rest of the world does not base their economic philosophies upon consumption. In fact, the philosophy has been, what do you do about income and employment to guide a nation's economic philosophy and direction? And that's what I was talking about in terms of these other countries that actually have strategies around wanting the good middle-income jobs that manufacturing can create, the technology and innovation it brings into their economy, the jobs it creates, the employment and income and increase in GDP, all of which, if you follow, as we have, this philosophy of consumer uber alles, then we give up this stuff. It's the unilateral disarmament in a way that you're getting at from Congressman Lipinski's office. I mean, you don't want that. There's got to be some kind of balance here. I mean, if you go out and price the tires we're talking about, you know what the increased price is? About 50 cents. I mean, there's some falsehoods here about pricing and things that come from. There are people that are making lots of money offshore, in between, and all these benefits are not necessarily shared by consumers either. It's not that simple a picture.
I don't want to get in the way of the next question, but I'd love a chance to say something on that.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, it's a big topic, and I didn't want to spend time on it in my spoken remarks, but one of the reasons that I think it makes sense to highlight these interests, the interests of the citizen as a consumer of public services, is because, especially with governments growing as they've recently done, the increases in government spending, I think it's all the more important now to be very clear about what our objectives are and be as transparent as we can be about the purpose of each program in order to be able to hold governments accountable. If we want to stimulate activity, there are ways of doing it that are different from procurement. You can subsidize things, If you're the Canadian government, you can reduce the cost of some of the inputs, as I just referred to, with capital equipment and so on. I get very worried when I hear people talk about a given program as being good for providing a certain service, stimulating economic activity, providing jobs in a depressed region. I could expand the list. You see where I'm going with this. At the end of the day, you're not going to be able to tell whether it worked, and that's not an accident. I worry a great deal about mixed mandates, because it's true that you might be able to imagine procurement programs where you don't buy the best quality at the lowest price because you've got some public good in mind. And a bureaucrat might make that decision very straightforwardly, thinking there's a public good in mind. But there are lots of other reasons why you might buy second best or at a higher price. You might do it because you're lazy. You might do it because of pork barreling. You might do it because of corruption. There are a lot of reasons why you might do it, and when I see these mixed mandates in an era where governments have gotten considerably larger and more powerful, my reaction is, let's try and keep things a little simpler here, because the day is going to come when we're going to want to know what happened to this money and whether it did any good. And it seems to me that you put those interests of the citizen as the user of the services front and center, and it guides you to the better answer.
Any next question? Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Scotty Greenwood, Canadian American Business Council. I thank the organizers and the speakers. Terrific program. Let me ask a question in this way. It seems to me that you are on opposite sides of the spectrum, but that you're answering a question, should we be complete free traders, for example, with China, or should we have a strategy that deals with China as a threat? Let me ask you, from a Canada-U.S. point of view, if you look at the way our economies here in just in Canada and the U.S. are so integrated, maybe dating back, let's go back to 1965, the Auto Pact, where we started building cars together, and then through the free trade agreement and NAFTA and beyond, it seems like our economies anyway are incredibly integrated. And I wonder if you think there's a way, each of you, that Canada and the U.S. together could sort of link arms and figure out how to deal with competition from the rest of the world, since we do have so much in common and we are so integrated, as opposed to, I think what worries Canadians about Buy American is that it might be directed at China, but it impacts Canada. So I just wonder if there's a middle ground there in the Canada-U.S. space.
Let me kick off. I'm sure we both have an answer to this. I think there's two things here. I'd like to make 2 points. One, China is the poster child for everything that's wrong with trade with the United States and I think Canada as well, because not because they have a strategy, as I said, but because of all the things they do illegally in support of it, currency manipulation. And this country and this Congress should pass currency legislation, and we should enforce our trade laws. This is a message we give directly to President Obama, the leaders of our institutions in Commerce and Treasury and other agencies, and as well as we talk to Congress, that there's legislation, we should move, we should be clear on this. So we need to address those issues. This isn't just a U.S. issue on currency. It is a global issue, and really the rest of the world's got to be involved. But it is not. I think the point here is it is China that is sort of the poster child for some of these big bad things that we're citing. But there's 5 other major economies and trading partners of both Canada and the U.S. that are that mirror the currency activity, because they see China as their major competition, and they're engaged in the same game of manipulation. So it goes beyond China. When it comes to countries having a strategy, Germany clearly has a strategy. Japan has a strategy. And they are a competition both for the U.S. and Canada because of the integration of our economies. And in particular, if you look at our auto industries, do we have a strategy at all? Well, we're stumbling towards one. Both countries decided we really wanted to have an auto industry, right? And now we partly own it, and I think we will not own it somewhere in the future, and they're recovering. But that was an important decision by our governments, by the unions, by everybody engaged in that yes, we want a domestic auto industry, and we need to make this investment because of the employment and income, because of the future opportunities that are there, and that you can't be an advanced industrial nation unless you have these. That industry alone accounts for 20 to 25% of all of manufacturing in Canada and the United States, and it may be even disproportionate in Canada a little bit. I don't know. I don't have the exact figures, but it is that important. So I come back to this point that we actually have common ground in terms of being two countries desperately in search of a strategy, and our two stumbling steps towards one in the United States were, one, to do things about auto, to pass the Recovery Act, and as I pointed out, Buy America is just a tactical move in what has to be a far more strategic discussion about the future of manufacturing in North America and how we go about that, and the things that we need to do as nations to have an industrial base that's there for the 21st century, and all the opportunities that come incumbent with that in energy policy and environmental policy, and taking advantage of it.
Very.
Just a second. Let's have a response here.
Well,
on the
can I just really quickly? So, would you support a Buy Canadian American? You know what I mean, or a Buy North American? Let's not talk about Mexico, but I'm just trying to understand what you just said. Would that, theoretically, could you live with something that looked like Buy Canada America?
I think theoretically we need a strategy, and I'm not going to say whether it's a Buy Canadian American. I think, again, that if we did that, it's still just a tactical issue of encouraging us to find somebody in those countries that make that stuff. It really begs the question of, do we actually have an economic development strategy? Do we have an industrial development strategy that we're going to have a high-speed rail industry in both our countries, that we're going to have a wind turbine industry and solar industry in our countries? I mean, these are big, big questions, and our government walked away from industrial policy towards the end of the Reagan administration, though he did some really important things in the creation of Semitech that saved the semiconductor industry in the United States. We haven't thought at scale like this. We didn't think we had to. And frankly, I think we've learned that, as Alan Greenspan said, gee, I never thought the markets wouldn't work. You know, they'd always self-correct. Well, I don't want any more self-correction than we've had. I think we actually need some balance here between getting the markets to work for us and a regulatory framework that allows them to do so.
Very wide-ranging question, so let me just touch on a couple of things. First, with regard to the car industry, I mean, we would have had a car industry if we hadn't bailed out GM and Chrysler. We still would have had a car industry in the future. By bailing out those two countries, we made an important decision about what kind of a car industry we would have. But in Canada, where we certainly felt our hand was forced and went along with the U.S. move, I would give a lot to see what the future might have looked like if we had run with Toyota, Honda, and Ford, and let the chips fall where they might have with GM and Chrysler. We'll never know, but I don't think that just because we did it, we should assume that it was necessarily the right thing to do. On Canada and the U.S. together against the rest of the world, it seems to me that the point to make is that the more we integrate the economies, the more we reduce the border as an unnecessary source of higher costs and uncertainty, the better the production base in North America will be for every purpose, including competing against the rest of the world. The one thing that concerns me a little bit about some of the discussion is that we look at these trade balances and we conclude that that's the indicator of success or failure. If you consume more than you produce, you will run a trade deficit. If you borrow from abroad in order to fill that gap, you will run a trade deficit. And if those patterns, if those macro patterns don't change, it doesn't matter what you do on the industrial level. You can affect the composition of your trade, but you're not going to get rid of an overall trade deficit. And so to the extent that we've decided that that's the way we're going to keep score, we're chasing, back to my swampy analogy, it's sort of a marsh light out there. You'll never get it.
Your analogy would be a will-o'-the-wisp for that. Okay, next question. Anybody else? I have a question for Bob. The bill raised the point on the procurement restrictions that it raises the cost of government procurement, but another criticism of it that's come up is that it also disrupts corporate supply chains, and particularly given how close the U.S. and Canada economies are integrated, but more broadly too. What would you do about that, or do you not see that as an issue?
Frankly, I don't see it as an issue, and here's why. We've actually worked with the government agencies around the implementation of Buy America. Now, at one point, the EPA had 30 waivers that had been granted for that. I mean, part of my point was the law doesn't say it has to be made in America. It says that's who you seek first as a vendor, and there are allowances and ways to waive that procurement rule, and that's exactly what has happened. What we have found is that people haven't looked. In the Department of Energy, as they instituted their program, we worked with that agency, and it was interesting enough. The first waiver request that came through, they actually followed up. And surprisingly enough, they found an American firm that produced the goods they needed at the price range that was competitive with this. And they sent out notices to others through our trade unions of list of waiver requests. We just try to hook them up with employers that make these things. Some of this stuff is that people don't even know the way our system operates. So the idea that it disrupts supply chains, or that, I think is misleading, because you can get waivers for these things. You do have arrangements for people who say, well, we had an arrangement with somebody else over there. They've never bothered to look for another vendor. So I guess the proof in the pudding is that where waiver requests have been needed, they've been granted. And we actually found that the EPA was working with these agencies because there's going to be, we frankly didn't put anywhere near what we need to in infrastructure in that bill, about $150 billion. We need a lot more money in jobs legislation. There's more being considered in Congress. One of the things that happened was the things they pulled off the shelf to go, the ones that haven't been funded, and if there's another round of infrastructure funding, they've already had the word that here's the rules that will be in place around this. And so people can be prepared to do that. I mean, we had no intention of disruption, worked very hard with these agencies to move stuff. We just want transparency in the system. If you put up an announcement of goods that are needed for a project, there's only one agency, the transportation, for some of its programs, that even utilizes our technology of the web. So there's transparency. Put it out there so American vendors know what's there, that they can bid on it. If they can't get it here, then get it someplace else, and you can get a waiver to do that.
I would rather have a 10% or whatever it is price preference across the board that's clearly there, everybody understands what it is, than have a system of waivers, because to me, the uncertainty and the lack of transparency in a process like that is as big an impediment to getting anything done as simply paying the premium would be. So I have a different take on it from Bob. It almost makes me nostalgic for the old world of tariffs, where you had a very straightforward price difference and everybody understood it. If you're heading into government with requests for preferences each time, I won't single out any particular provinces in Canada, but there are some where there are unspecified preferences that may or may not get waivers depending on what kind of a case can be made. I mean, that's not a world that I think is appropriate for North America to be venturing further into. There are other parts of the world where that sort of practice is much more common. I think in general it's very unpleasant for people. And so I'd say, just from the cost point of view, you might be better off just saying, okay, there's going to be a given preferential margin, and that's it, and it applies to everybody, and that's the rule. So that's my quick editorial on
we actually do allow for a preference.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? Let me ask each of you to give a quick 30-second comment on whether or not the negotiators did a good job in dealing with this immediate problem. And what should go forward? What should happen going forward?
Well, I think my response is pretty simple. It was never our problem. Everything we did was legal. It was Canada that needed to come and negotiate with the United States around things that they had in their own laws that prevented them from being part of this process, and they solved that. I don't think it does much to solve anything that I've raised about the larger context about a strategy for our future economy and manufacturing's role within that.
I'm very pleased that an agreement was reached. I think that it showed a commendable sense of urgency. As I said, I think that what was done could have been tidied up a little bit. But Bob offers some hostages to fortune in the argument that if it's legal, it must be okay. I mean, we change these laws over time for a reason. We know how we can improve them. The laws that Bob is now citing as are having been brought into closer compliance with are of relatively recent invention. We're talking about something from the mid-1990s. So I don't see why we should regard that as the world within which we have to just work at little margins. It seems to me that Canada and the United States could usefully go a large step further. The political climate for it might be kind of awkward, but if Canada and the U.S. can't do it, who in the world can? I think it was a good thing to do, but the commitment to further negotiation should be taken very seriously, and we should go from there.
Okay. Any other questions? Charlie?
Thanks, Bill. Charles Bloom. I've got actually a lot of comments and questions, which I won't bring up, but I would like to just pick up on Mr. Robson's nostalgia for the old tariff world. Well, you know, in the old tariff world, there was no government procurement agreement. There was never an issue about liberalizing. We try to liberalize trade in this area and look at the mess that we've created. And I want to go to the end of that mess, which is we're integrated, of course, all right? We're talking about a very special part of the world economy here, right? What about the real world economy that plays by different rules, where the government sector is not shrinking, it's growing, where they don't have any respect for the outside world, they always buy national, they promote their own interests at the expense of trading partners, they're beyond the reach of any rules. I mean, let's get real. If we can't solve that problem, whatever we do together doesn't matter, right? And that's where Bob's point about production. We are in a production crisis in America, which is equally Canada's crisis, because you've chosen to integrate yourselves so closely with us that if we don't become a producing nation again, you've made a bad bet. So what I'd like to see is real hard thinking about how to bring the state capitalists into a system of rules that really work. I think until we deal with that, honestly, what we do in the U.S.-Canada context is kind of a waste of time. I invite your comments on those views, either one of you. Thanks.
I think there's a simple analogy here, Charlie, that we probably share, is that I think the U.S. and Canada is playing football. The rest of the world is playing soccer, and it's a completely different game. And they're not only is it a different game, it's a different set of rules. And I think, as the nature of our two economies, we really need to wake up to this. And it's not molding the rest of the world in our image, but is recognizing the world is operating a very different way and finding a middle ground in all of that in which all of us can, work and compete together. We're not there. And the longer we continue to play the game we're in, the more we have to lose. And believe me, as I cited earlier, the losses for the working people in the United States and Canada, and the United States has been more severe, have been horrendous, been absolutely horrendous, and we cannot go on like this any longer.
We aren't going to mold the rest of the world to be more like us, but we certainly don't, I think, want to mold ourselves to be more like the rest of the world. Japan's industrial strategy looked brilliant until it fell apart, and they've stagnated for 2 decades now. We don't want to be like China. I mean, we don't, right? Who in this room would say that we want to be more like China? China is suppressing the living standards of its own people in order to accomplish some of those goals. It's a distortion that is at their cost. As I said over and over again, when you put up these barriers against the outside world, it's you that suffers the most. Here in North America, why are we suffering right now? Because we over-promoted, and this was a policy failure. I don't want, now that I'm in Washington, I don't get to say this very often in Washington. The bubble that just burst was a bubble that was created by public policy that fostered overinvestment in housing. And because of the financial leverage attached, when it popped brutally. But in Canada as well, the proportion of the capital stock that is residential housing has risen astonishingly over the course of the last couple of decades. We've overinvested in housing, and we've underinvested in plant and equipment. We've underinvested in infrastructure. And if we want to be better off in the future, that's the imbalance we have to fix. And we can do that ourselves regardless of what the Chinese do.
Bill, I got to ask you a question here. I mean, you just said a second ago, and we absolutely agree. China engages in all kinds of bad behavior. It suppresses the rights of the worker. But a minute ago, you're making an argument that we should be buying those Chinese tires because it's cheaper for the American consumer, which has been accomplished through currency manipulation, through the suppression of the rights of workers in that country, to give them this advantage, and which, frankly, our corporations, our transnational corporations, they aren't American or Canadian anymore, have taken absolute advantage of. So how can, I mean, this is where I get confused when you want to make a consumer argument about dealing with China when they engage in this incredibly illegal behavior that is absolute subsidies of the goods that you say we're going to get from them that are going to be cheaper.
The United States subsidizes food exports. Would the rest of the world be better off to put up barriers against that so that their consumers had to pay more? Or would they be better off to eat the food? I'd say they should eat the food.
That's not about tires and subsidies that have been engaged there, is my point. You make an argument for the consumers. We agree that China engages in illegal behavior, but then we're supposed to say that's okay, we should get the tires from there? That doesn't compute. I mean, that's part of the confusion around this, and I think it's back to Charlie's bigger question as well as mine of, yes, China's got a strategy. They're not the only country. Other countries do too. And we're not suggesting we become more like them and suppress the rights of workers. God forbid. That's not the point here. The point here is, how do we work with the rest of the world to raise their standards, which we've not done in our trade deals? I mean, that's what's happened with NAFTA. That's what's going on with China. We don't deal with the environment. We don't deal with labor rights in these countries. And in fact, we succeed in undermining our own ability to keep our per capita income at a level it's been. We're not doing anything to raise theirs or setting up agreements whereby that should be part of the economic development process of these countries. The European Union actually tried to do this when it first expanded. And in the post-World War II era, it wasn't trade that made the world so great. It's in fact they put in place policies in these countries that required constitutionally the right of unions to organize and bargain collectively so they could raise their own wages, benefits, and improve their working conditions. And 20 years later, 30 years later, as we saw German product and Japanese firms compete and come into the American market, we saw that it worked, and their workers make wages better or equal to what we make in this country. They became a high-wage, high-skill economy. That's kind of a trade world I want to live in and kind of agreements that I want to have. But that is not what a WTO, that's not what's going on in Doha. That's not what happened in NAFTA. I mean, it's a different cut at how we think about trade deals and economic development that go together to raise the standards of everybody, not to play a game where we play wage arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage, environmental arbitrage that firms run around the world and take advantage of. We need to be thinking of how we better the working conditions of working people and our countries as a whole. This cutthroat competition only benefits corporations that want to take advantage of these situations.
And Bill, you have the last word.
Well, I think that probably this has been a good illustration of the fact that there is a huge difference in the way that Bob and I approach this. The arguments that Bob just made were very current in Canada during the debate over having a free trade agreement with the United States. There were many Canadians who said that the United States, they said wrongly, but they said that the United States had lower environmental standards on the whole. They certainly were critical of many U.S. labor standards. They worried about the greater volumes of production. They worried about U.S. subsidies to particular industries. And there was a whole raft of dire predictions made of what would happen in Canada. We went that road and didn't regret it afterwards. One of the reasons that we were successful during the free trade agreement was because we did something that North America as a whole now needs to do. We reduced our government deficits, we stopped over-consuming, we started investing more, and we positioned ourselves well to take advantage of that. This is a rather... For those of you who are more industrial policy aficionados, I'm not going to convince you with the final thing I'm going to say here. But for those of you who do have a bit of a free trade bias in you, I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier. If the United States wants to subsidize its exports of food, I'd say let's eat up.
Okay, well, particular thanks to both Bob and Bill. Thank you very much.